Hello, Robs. We're back with We Gathered Together, the story of Thanksgiving by Ralph and Adelin Linton. We move on to Chapter 4, Squanto, a neglected hero. Never mind the pounding that you're about to hear because they're working on an old Victorian house across the street. The Pilgrims undoubtedly brought memories of such English harvest home celebrations with them when they came to the New World. They had also witnessed Thanksgiving ceremonies during their sojourn in Holland, for the Dutch were addicted to proclaiming public days of prayer. Where'd it go? And Thanksgiving to commemorate military victories and other special events. The Pilgrims themselves would have denied that the Thanksgiving feast in honor of their first harvest in 1621 was evoked by memories of the profane practices of the Old World. However, all revolutionaries, political or religious, once their goal is accomplished, turn back to the patterns of the society in which they have been reared, and the Pilgrims at the time of the first Thanksgiving were no exception. To be sure, the Pilgrims felt that human ceremonies should respond to the dispensations of Providence, and they objected to celebrations fixed by the calendar. It was not until 1863, 242 years after the Pilgrim Harvest Feast, that Thanksgiving became an annual event. And even now the date is supposedly announced each year and not fixed by the calendar, which may be a concession to the Pilgrim attitude. The holidays of the Church of England were regarded by the Pilgrims as Roman corruptions. There was no warrant in Scripture for Christmas or Easter, and only the most benighted would take cognizance of such pagan rituals. On their first Christmas in Plymouth, the colonists worked hard laying out the site of their common house and felling timbers. The skipper of the Mayflower, who didn't share the Pilgrims' scorn for this day, broke out a barrel of beer and drank Christmas toasts with his crew. Some of those still living aboard the ship joined in, but for the weary men ashore, there were only scant rations and little shelter against the sore storm of wind and rain, which battered the coast that Christmas night. The harvest feast of the following autumn was the first holiday which the colonists had recognized in their new home. They were in a mood for rejoicing. The specter of starvation no longer menaced, or so they thought. They were at peace with the Indians, and they rejoiced to be able to share their bounty with the savages, and to let their weary spirits soar in 3 days of feast and sport with scant emphasis on religion. The man whose help and devotion contributed most to making that autumn a time of thankfulness rather than despair was a Patuxet Indian, Squanto, or Tisquantum. Squanto has never received his due from American history. Though New England is dotted with monuments and plaques immortalizing the names of the Pilgrim Fathers, there is no formal tribute to the Indian saint of Plymouth. Only a lonely promontory on the Massachusetts coast, Squantum Point above Quincy, and a grubby side street in Plymouth are named for him. From the beginning, Squanto's destiny was strangely linked with that of the white men. In 1605, an English exploring party led by Captain George Weymouth had landed on the coast of New England in the region later settled by the Pilgrims. In the course of their explorations, they captured several Indians, whom they took back to England with them as souvenirs of the voyage. Among these was Squanto, a young brave of the Patuxet. Squanto was apparently well treated in England. There is little information about this first adventure among the whites, but he pined for his native land. In 1614, when Captain John Smith set out on an expedition to the New World, Squanto sailed with him. The fleet landed at Plymouth, then called Thieves' Harbor, and Squanto returned to his tribe, though not for long. One of the ships in Smith's fleet remained in the New World when the other sailed. Its commander, Captain Thomas Hunt, was instructed to trade with the Indians and collect a cargo of beaver pelts and fish. In the course of this trading, Hunt, a dishonest rascal, lured some Indians aboard his ship, where he had them bound and thrown into the hold. Among these unfortunates was the recently returned Squanto. Hunt sailed for Spain, where he put into the port of Malaga and sold the poor silly savages for rials of 8 in the slave market there. The other Indians were never heard of again. They probably died rather than submit to white domination, for the red men were never broken to slavery. Squanto, however, had the good fortune to be brought by some local friars who treated him well and gave him instruction in the Christian faith. Some years later, he managed to get away to England, where John Slaney, treasurer of the Newfoundland Company, discovered him and took him into his home. But again, Squanto yearned for his own home. When Mr. Slaney learned that his friend Captain Thomas Dermer was setting forth on an exploring trip to New England, he made arrangements for Squanto to go along. In 1690, Squanto arrived once again on his native soil, probably the first American Indian to make 2 round trips to Europe. Captain Dermer's first port was the island of Monhegan off the coast of what is now called Maine. This island was an important English fishing station in those days. Here the vessel picked up Samoset, a chief of the Wabanaki. They then sailed for Plymouth Harbor, dropping anchor there about 6 months before the arrival of the Pilgrims. This was the territory of the Patuxent. But Squanto, eager to rejoin his own people once more, found only loneliness and horror. While he had been in England, a plague had exterminated the entire tribe. All his family, all his tribesmen were gone. He found only empty fields and deserted villages, in some of which the dead still lay unburied in the crumbling huts. This plague was probably either smallpox or measles. These diseases were unknown on the American continent until they were introduced by the European sailors and the Aboriginal population, who had built up no immunity to them. They were as deadly as the Black Death. After his tragic homecoming, Squanto went to live among the Wampanoag, a neighboring tribe who had also been sadly decimated by disease, but they were not his people, and Squanto was restless and unhappy. The Indians, having good reason to be suspicious of the whites, had kept their distance for some time after the colonists' arrival. The Pilgrims, during their first few months in the New World, had seen only small parties of Indians in the distance. Samoset, Squanto's friend, the Wabanaki from Monhegan, made the first overture toward the white men. About the middle of March, Samoset, escorted by a small band of Wampanoag, entered the Plymouth territory. The other Indians remained in the woods on the far side of the stream, but Samoset marched confidently down the main street of the little village, to the astonishment and consternation of the colonists. William Bradford reported that he very boldly came all alone and along the houses straight to the rendezvous, where he intercepted him, not suffering him to go in, as undoubtedly he would out of his boldness. He saluted us in English and bade us welcome, I'm supposing it means, for he had learned some broken English among the Englishmen that came to fish at Monhegan, and knew by name most of the captains, commanders, and masters. He was the first savage with whom the Pilgrims had spoken, and they were amazed to find him self-possessed and friendly. His costume, or rather lack of it, embarrassed the modest colonists, for he was stark naked, only a leather about his waist, with a fringe about a span long. I see what they're doing. It's Old English here. They hurriedly wrapped him in the cloak of one of the elders, on the pretext that the wind was rising, but it is more likely that they were protecting their womenfolk from the spectacle of a naked man. Samoset stayed several days. In fact, he enjoyed the hospitality so much that the colonists had to drive him away, for they could not continue to entertain him with white bread and strong waters from their meager stores. He returned a week later, however, bringing Massasoit Sagamore of the Wampanoag, his brother Quadquina, 60 of their men, and Squanto. This was a Thursday, the 22nd of March, a very fair, warm day. The other Indians departed after they had received suitable hospitality, all except Squanto, who adopted the Pilgrims as his own people and never left them until his death 2 years later. Squanto, already a Christian, when he joined the colony, became one of the Pilgrim saints, as those were called who held to the strictest tenets of the Pilgrim theology. The colonists who were more lax in doctrine were known as strangers. Squanto's gifts as an interpreter, his understanding of the habits and attitudes of the Indians, his knowledge of the techniques of hunting, fishing, and farming in that environment, all were invaluable to the colonists. It was largely due to Squanto that the Pilgrims were able to establish and preserve peace and friendly trade with their aboriginal neighbors. Governor Bradford records that he was a special instrument sent by God for their good beyond expectation. He endeared himself the second day he was with them by going at noon to fish for eels, I'm guessing that is. At night he came home with as many as he could well lift in one hand, which our people were glad of. They were fat and sweet. He trod them out with his feet, and so caught them with his hands without any other instrument. The devout band which had landed on Plymouth Rock in December 1620 were a courageous and hard-working lot, but they were ill-equipped both personally and materially for hewing a livelihood from a formidable wilderness. They were for the most part townsfolk, shopkeepers, and artisans, and few of them had experience in farming and building. They had not even brought adequate tools for cutting timber or lines and hooks for fishing. They had been drawn to the New World not by the lure of new lands to exploit, but by their zeal for serving the Lord in their own way, and they expected him to give them strength. It does seem that some divine providence was looking after these innocents, for despite all their hardships, they did manage to survive and to found a permanent colony, which would have been impossible if certain fortunate circumstances had not combined to aid them. The extermination of the Patuxet, while tragic for the tribe, was not an ill wind which bore nobody good. If the Pilgrims had landed in the territory of a strong tribe who jealously guarded their cleared fields and their hunting grounds, the band could never have established a foothold on these shores. They barely survived the first winter, even when they were able to take over Patuxet lands, with no interference from the Indians. The arrival of Squanto was another great blessing, for without his help they would have had no corn crop to be thankful for that autumn, and they could not have established peaceful trade relations with the Indians. The third piece of good fortune was the finding of a cache of Indian corn. The Pilgrims probably considered this to be an act of providence also, although the aborigine who had raised and stored the corn must have regarded it as plain larceny. This happy find occurred shortly after the Mayflower had made its first landing at Cape Cod in what is now Provincetown Harbor. Here on November 13th, 1620, the weary voyagers who had been shut up in the storm-tossed little ship for over 2 months at last felt solid ground under their feet. The children, wild with joy, ran shouting up and down the beaches. The women brought out great bundles of dirty clothes and did a gigantic laundering in the fresh streams, a service of which they had great need. As can well be imagined, ravenous for fresh food, the young people waded into the chill waters and dragged out oysters, mussels, and crabs, which were gobbled by all the voyagers, with dire results in some cases. During all this activity, the sentries kept an anxious watch, for none knew when savages might come swooping over the dunes. Captain Miles Standish organized a scouting party to explore the territory, to see whether or not it was desirable for settlement. In spite of the fine harbor and the prepared fields, they determined to look farther, for there was not an adequate supply of fresh water on the sandy cape. The explorers encountered only one small party of Indians, who fled at sight of them. However, they saw harvested cornfields, Indian huts, and a number of graves, which they dug up but restored again because they felt it would be odious unto us to ransack their sepulchres. The houses were round like unto an arbor, and made from sapling branches covered with mats, with a chimney hole in the top. The huts had been recently vacated, for the white men found there fresh venison, earthenware pots, and baskets made from crab shells and from woven fiber. They calmly helped themselves to some of the best things. Their most important discovery was made near what is now the village of Truro, at the spot still called Corn Hill, which was the Pilgrims' name for it. Here, hidden under the hillocks of sand, they found a large woven basket containing about 4 bushels of seed corn, which had been cached there by the natives for spring planting. Some 36 goodly ears of corn, some yellow and some red, and others mixed with blue, which was a very goodly sight. Maize, or Indian corn, is an American plant that was unknown in Europe until the early explorers began to take it back home with them. There was more in the cache than the marauders could carry, but they filled an iron kettle, which they had with them, stowed as much as they could about their persons, and made careful note of the location. A few days later, they returned and got the rest of it, as well as several other caches which they discovered, making about 10 bushels in all. And sure it was God's good providence that we found this corn, for else we know not how we should have done, for we knew not how we should find or meet with any of the Indians, except it to be do us a mischief. It apparently never entered their pious heads that they were doing a mischief in depriving the poor savages of their next year's crop. It is fortunate that the Pilgrims decided to move on to Plymouth, for they would scarcely have been popular in that territory, and they could not have taken over the cornfields without a bitter fight. These stores of seed corn would not have been enough to save the colonists from starvation the next winter if they had not had the vacant cornfields of the Patuxent in which to plant the crop. The labor of clearing fields and building houses in one winter would have been more than they could do, nor would the fields have been enough if they had not had Squanto to teach them how to handle the crop. The Patuxent lands were old, exhausted fields which would not produce without fertilization. Squanto showed them how to plant the corn in properly spaced hillocks with 3 little herring in each hill, their noses together and their tails fanning out. He also helped them to build weirs in the brooks to catch the herring at the time of the spring run, and cautioned them to put guards over the fields to prevent the ravenous animals from digging up the fish. The time for planting corn, Squanto said, was when the leaves of the oak trees were the size of a squirrel's ear. The Pilgrims had much to be thankful for that first autumn in the New World. They had survived their first terrible winter, that is, a sufficient number had survived so that the colony could be carried on. Of the 100 who had landed from the Mayflower, only 50 survived to participate in the first Thanksgiving feast. Half of the original colonists lay under unmarked, plowed-over graves. The colonists had not dared to hold funeral services or to mark the graves, not wishing to let the savages know how many of their numbers were gone. In many cases, whole families had been wiped out, and only one had not lost at least one member. This was the Billingtons, who were not among the saints, being considered quite profane by the more orthodox members of the group. That this family should have survived intact while the more godly perished must have given the saints to ponder on the inscrutable ways of the Lord. The death toll was highest among the women. It's the German Harvest Festival. The Horky Load. Stone of Massasoit. The first Thanksgiving dinner in New England from an old print. Actually, the Pilgrims did not build log cabins, as is noted in the text, nor did the East Coast Indians of the period wear fringed shirts. Bellman reading the governor's Thanksgiving proclamation in a New England town, courtesy of the Batman Archive. Thanksgiving in New York. Young masqueraders demand gifts of promenaders on Fifth Avenue. Thanksgiving at a New England farmhouse, from a drawing by F.A. Chapman. Only 5 out of 18 wives survive. The women probably denied themselves their share of the rations, already down the starvation level during that winter, in order that their children might have enough food. There were some days during January and February when only a handful of men were well enough to go forward with the urgent tasks. The many deaths were not due to any epidemic. From the inadequate records we have, they seem to have been due to a combination of scurvy. There was little to eat except bread made from the meal brought by the Mayflower, and pneumonia caused by exposure and weakened physical condition. But with the coming of spring, there were wild greens which could be eaten as salad. There were berries and fruits, and the fish and game became plentiful enough so that even such inept fishermen and hunters as the Pilgrims could bag all that they needed. With the warm weather and a balanced diet, the health of the colonists improved. Governor John Carver died of a sunstroke that spring from working in the fields without a hat, but after this sad loss there were no deaths and little sickness all that summer. When the Mayflower sailed for England, not a single colonist elected to turn from the rigorous life in the New World and go back with the ship. And I will end there because I gotta get ready for work. Not that you care, but goodbye. Goodbye, Bob. Goodbye.